On the morning of June 7, 1944, the day after the largest amphibious invasion in the history of human warfare had successfully established itself on the beaches of Normandy, Major Werner Schulz of German military intelligence stood in his map room in Paris and said something that would define the next 3 weeks of the war in the West. Freeze 19 divisions in place on the wrong coast of France, and hand the Allies the breathing room they needed to make the liberation of Western Europe irreversible. He said, "This is not the invasion." The map on the wall behind him showed everything. It showed the Allied landing zones in Normandy, marked in red, the 5 beaches, the parachute drop zones, the expanding perimeter that had spent the previous 24 hours absorbing everything the Wehrmacht could throw at it, and holding, consolidating, digging in with a permanence that the defenders had not anticipated and could not seem to reverse. It showed the German 7th Army, battered and disorganized and fighting to contain something it had not been mentally or logistically prepared to face. And it showed, in the southeast corner of England, in the counties of Kent and East Anglia, clustered against the narrowest point of the English Channel at the Strait of Dover, something far larger. Something so large that by any rational measure of military logic, it dwarfed what had landed in Normandy. A concentration of Allied forces that filled the map legend, that required its own color coding, that represented, by the intelligence estimates Schulz had been building and refining for 4 months, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 men in over 40 divisions. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds of landing craft, the full weight of what German intelligence had assessed as the primary Allied strike force in the Western theater, commanded by the one Allied general the German High Command feared above all others. General George S. Patton, the man who had outmaneuvered Rommel's Afrika Korps in North Africa, the most aggressive and tactically gifted commander the Allies had produced. And Patton had not moved. Patton's army was still in England, still massed at Dover, still pointed at Calais, still waiting. Which meant, by the iron logic of the map Schulz had built from 18 months of intelligence work, that what was happening in Normandy was a diversion. A feint on a massive scale, designed to pull the German reserves south and west before the real blow fell. The real blow was still coming, and it was going to land at Pas-de-Calais. Schulz was wrong. The map was wrong. Every single piece of intelligence that had built that map over the previous 18 months was wrong in the only way that mattered. It described a reality that did not exist. The agents who reported Patton's army were wrong. The radio intercepts that confirmed its disposition were wrong. The aerial reconnaissance photographs that showed the vehicle parks and the supply depots and the landing craft massing in the Dover harbors were wrong. The order of battle assessments, the divisional locations, the estimated strength returns, the reports of training exercises and supply movements and command structure changes, all of it, every scrap of intelligence that had constructed the picture of a massive Allied force poised to strike at Calais was a fabrication. An elaborate, painstaking, breathtakingly audacious fabrication built by British intelligence over 18 months, staffed by actors and doubled agents and inflatable rubber tanks and carefully timed radio transmissions from equipment pointed at empty fields. The 1st United States Army Group, the force on that map, the force that was holding 19 German divisions frozen at Calais while Normandy burned, the force that Schulz briefed to his superiors every morning with the confidence of a man who has done his homework, did not exist. It had never existed. It was a ghost army, built from nothing, sustained by lies, and it was in the process of winning the war. To understand how a map that showed an army that did not exist came to govern the strategic decisions of the most powerful military institution in Europe, you have to go back further than June of 1944. You have to go back to the fundamental problem that German military intelligence faced from the moment it became clear that an Allied invasion of Western Europe was not merely possible, but inevitable. The problem was simple enough to state and almost impossible to solve with the tools available. Where would the Allies land? The coastline of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands stretched for thousands of miles, And while not every meter of it was equally suitable for a major amphibious assault, there were enough viable options to make the question genuinely and dangerously open. The Allies could strike at Pas de Calais, the shortest channel crossing, the most direct overland route into the industrial heart of Germany, the logistically sensible choice that every German staff officer had studied in his training and considered the obvious Allied preference. They could land in Normandy, further west along the French coast, with its wide and relatively accessible beaches and its lighter defensive installations. They could attempt a landing in the Bay of Biscay, threatening the southern approach to Germany. They could strike at Norway or Denmark, destabilizing the entire northern flank of the German position in Europe. They could, and this was the nightmare scenario that kept German planners awake at night, execute multiple simultaneous or sequential landings at different points along the coast, dividing German reserves and preventing any concentrated response. The German High Command had to defend all of it with finite and increasingly strained resources. The one thing that could have simplified that problem, accurate intelligence about Allied intentions, was precisely what they could not obtain. And they could not obtain it because of a catastrophe so complete and so invisible that the German intelligence apparatus did not fully understand what had happened to it until the war was over and the files were opened and the truth was finally visible in all its devastating clarity. Every agent the Abwehr had sent to Britain, every asset it had cultivated in the United Kingdom, every source it believed was reporting genuine information from inside England, had been compromised. The British intelligence service had, through a combination of the extraordinary cryptographic achievement of breaking the German Enigma cipher machine, careful and patient detective work, and the remarkable loyalty of people who might have cooperated with the German intelligence services but chose not to, identified and captured essentially every German agent operating in the United Kingdom. Some had been arrested immediately. Others had been given a choice: work for us or face the consequences. Most had chosen to work for their captors. The turned agents continued to send messages to their German handlers in Berlin and Hamburg. The messages they sent used the correct codes, the correct procedural language, the correct personal details that their handlers would recognize as authenticating. But the content of the messages was not the truth. It was precisely calibrated fiction, designed by men and women who understood German intelligence methodology deeply enough to feed it information that would be believed, that would reinforce existing German assumptions about Allied intentions, and that would ultimately direct German strategic decisions in exactly the direction the British needed them to go. This program was called the Double Cross System, named for the double agent at its heart and for the double cross, the XX, that summarized its operational concept. And it was, by the end of the war, the most comprehensively successful strategic deception operation in the history of modern warfare. But the double-cross system's success in the spring and summer of 1944 depended entirely on the quality of the fiction it was selling. And the fiction it had chosen to sell to the German High Command was among the most ambitious intelligence fabrications ever attempted in the history of organized conflict. The story being told to German commanders through the turned agents, through the carefully managed radio traffic, through the selectively timed leaks, and the staged signals intelligence that German cryptanalysts were permitted to intercept and decode, was this: the Allies had organized their invasion forces into two distinct army groups. The first, under General Bernard Montgomery, was a relatively modest force positioned in the southwest of England, in Devon and Dorset, opposite the Normandy coast. The second, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, was vastly larger, commanded by Patton, positioned in the southeast, in Kent and East Anglia, directly opposite Pas de Calais. Montgomery's force might make a preliminary or diversionary landing in Normandy or somewhere nearby. The real invasion, the decisive and overwhelming blow that would decide the war, would be delivered by Patton's army, at Calais. Building this fiction in a way that would withstand rigorous scrutiny required more than the reports of turned agents. German intelligence was not naive. It cross-referenced everything it received against independent sources: aerial reconnaissance, direct radio traffic analysis, physical observation by whatever neutral or clandestine assets it could deploy. A story told by one agent could be disinformation. A story confirmed from multiple independent directions, through channels that could not plausibly have been coordinated, carried the weight of truth. The deception therefore had to account for all of those channels simultaneously, had to present a consistent picture through every window that German intelligence might look through. Inflatable rubber tanks were positioned in the East Anglian countryside, visible from German reconnaissance aircraft, indistinguishable at altitude from genuine armor. Fake landing craft were constructed and moored in the Thames estuary and the southeastern ports, providing the physical evidence of an amphibious force assembling for a cross-channel assault. Entire radio networks were established to transmit the traffic patterns of Army Corps and divisional headquarters that did not exist, using the correct call signs and the correct procedural language and the correct volume and rhythm of messages that a real formation of that size and type would generate. Patton himself was deployed as a public figure, appearing at carefully staged events in England, photographed in Kent and East Anglia, his presence confirming to any observer, neutral diplomat, foreign journalist, German agent, that the most dangerous Allied general was personally present with the forces opposite Calais. Every channel of German intelligence, when it looked at the map of England, saw the same coherent and mutually corroborating picture. A massive army, at Dover, ready to cross. There was one man in Paris whose specific professional responsibility was to synthesize all of this intelligence into the picture that German commanders would use to make their decisions. Schulz was not a fool. He was, by any reasonable professional standard, a careful and methodical intelligence analyst who had spent 3 years developing his understanding of Allied capabilities and intentions from every piece of evidence available to him. He had learned to distrust single-source reporting and to insist on independent corroboration before crediting any significant intelligence claim. He cross-referenced everything. He maintained what he believed was genuine skepticism about information that seemed too convenient or that confirmed existing assessments too perfectly. He was aware of the theoretical possibility of a coordinated Allied deception campaign. He had read the historical literature on strategic deception and knew its principles. He believed, with the professional confidence of a man who has thought carefully about the limits of his own methods, that he had built safeguards against it. And the result of his careful, skeptical, cross-referenced multi-source analysis was the map on the wall. The map that showed Patton at Dover. The map that showed the ghost army of the 1st United States Army Group. The map that was, in every particular, precisely what British intelligence had spent 18 months designing it to be. In the months before June, there had been a single piece of evidence that did not fit. A report from a source Schulz rated as reliable in its track record, which noted that recent Allied landing exercises along the British coast had concentrated on beach profiles and tidal characteristics more consistent with the Normandy shoreline than with Calais. It was not a dramatic report. It was a technical observation, buried in a routine assessment, easy to overlook in the volume of intelligence flowing through Schulz's section every day. He had not overlooked it. He had read it carefully, weighed it against the considerably larger body of evidence, pointing to Calais as the primary target, and concluded that it represented one of two things: either a deliberate Allied deception, a carefully placed piece of misleading technical intelligence designed to sow doubt in the German assessment, or a genuine preparation for the secondary landing in Normandy that his overall picture already anticipated and accounted for. He had filed it, noted it in his records as a data point requiring monitoring, and continued his briefings with the map unchanged. The one piece of evidence that could have altered the picture had been evaluated through the lens of the picture, found ambiguous, and set aside. The picture survived. The invasion came at Normandy in the early hours of June 6, 1944. For the first critical hours, the German response was governed almost entirely by the conviction that Normandy was the diversion. At every level of command, from the coastal defenders scrambling in the concrete bunkers to hold the beaches, to the Panzer Division commanders who had been waiting months for this moment and were now desperate for orders, to the staff officers in Paris and in Berlin processing the incoming reports with expressions that mixed alarm with professional calculation. The framework through which events were being interpreted was the framework Schulz's map had established and maintained. The parachute drops were heavy, but they were behind the Normandy beaches, not behind Calais. The naval bombardment was immense, but it was concentrated on the Normandy sector. The scale of the assault was larger than a standard diversion, but the Allies would have understood that a convincing diversion required genuine scale. The reserves needed to be held. The 15th Army, positioned at Calais, needed to stay where it was. The real blow was coming, and when it came, the reserves needed to be there to meet it. This reasoning was not irrational. Given the picture Schulz had built and briefed, given the intelligence that had constructed it, given the consistent confirmation from every source the German High Command trusted, the interpretation that Normandy was a diversion was the logical conclusion. The tragedy was not that German commanders made an illogical decision. The tragedy was that they made the perfectly logical decision that British intelligence had spent 18 months engineering them to make. The panzers that were finally released toward Normandy moved too late, in insufficient numbers, piecemeal, against a sky that Allied air power had made into a killing ground. The window of genuine vulnerability that Rommel had correctly identified, the first 24 hours, when the beachhead was still shallow and fragile and potentially reversible, was allowed to close. The Allies consolidated, the reinforcements came ashore, the perimeter deepened, and the 15th Army waited at Calais for the blow that never came. It did not come in the first week after D-Day, when Hitler, shown the intelligence reports confirming that Fusag remained in England and Patton remained at Dover, refused to release the 15th Army's divisions despite urgent requests from his commanders on the ground. It did not come in the second week when the Normandy beachhead had expanded to the point where German counterattacks were failing to reduce it, and the Allied buildup was visibly outpacing the German ability to reinforce. It did not come in the third week, when the evidence available to any observer willing to look at what was actually happening rather than at what the intelligence picture said was going to happen was beginning to point unmistakably toward the conclusion that there was no second invasion, that there never had been a second invasion, that the army at Dover was not coming because it did not exist. Hitler continued to hold the 15th Army in place. His intelligence advisors continued to brief the picture. The map continued to show what it had always shown: Patton at Dover, Fusag at Calais, the decisive blow still pending. It was not until late July, nearly 7 weeks after D-Day, that the German High Command finally and fully accepted that the Calais landing was not coming. By that point, the American breakout at St. Lo had begun. General Patton, the real Patton, commanding the real Third Army, which had crossed to France not at Calais but through the Normandy beachhead, was driving his tanks across the landscape of Brittany and turning east toward Paris. The Falaise pocket was forming. Paris would fall in weeks. Germany had lost the campaign in the west, and the road to that loss ran in a straight line from the map room in Paris, from the wall map that showed the Ghost Army, from the months of careful intelligence work that had constructed a picture of reality so complete and so convincing that it had been preferred to reality itself. After the war, when the double-cross files were opened and the full architecture of the deception became visible, there was a particular quality to the accounts left by the German intelligence officers who had been most directly involved in building and maintaining the false picture. They were not primarily defensive. They were genuinely, professionally curious. They had been defeated by a method they believed they had safeguards against, and they wanted to understand how it had worked. What they found, when they looked honestly at the record, was not a failure of methodology. Their methods had been sound. Their cross-referencing had been genuine. Their skepticism had been real, if not ultimately sufficient. What had defeated them was something more fundamental than any technique or procedure could have protected against. The systematic construction of a false reality that was more internally consistent, more thoroughly corroborated, and more comprehensively documented than the true reality that they needed to see. The British had not beaten German intelligence by exploiting its weaknesses. They had beaten it by satisfying its standards so completely that it had no basis on which to doubt what it was being shown. One map was wrong. It was not wrong because the man who built it was careless, or lazy, or incompetent. It was wrong because the information that built it had been designed, from its first element to its last, to produce exactly the map it produced. And the map, that single document, pinned to a wall in a requisitioned building in Paris, marked with the symbols and colors and notations of professional military intelligence, held 19 divisions frozen at Calais while the war was being decided, permanently and irrevocably, on the beaches and in the hedgerows 60 miles to the west. Not by the weight of Allied arms, not by the courage of Allied soldiers, though that courage was real, and its cost was enormous. By the weight of a fiction, by the genius of a deception, by the map that showed everything except the truth.